Today's video contains content that may be considered sensitive by some viewers. Also, if you enjoy what you hear, please consider subscribing to the channel as it really does help me grow. And, of course, thank you. Have you ever experienced a place that makes you so uncomfortable that you avoid it at all costs, but at the same time it draws you into it? There's this forest in my hometown that my parents used to take me camping in as a kid. I loved camping for the most part. When we camped out by this little beach or over in Tennessee, it was fun, but as far as I can remember, anytime we went to camp in this forest, it was dreadful. I remember as a kid being really scared and nervous when we were there, and my parents just tried to assure me that it was because the trees were really tall. They weren't wrong about the trees, though. I don't know what kind of trees they were, but they were extremely tall and thin with even thinner branches that all curved straight upward. Because the trees were so slim, though, there were a lot more of them. And looking straight up, it seemed to be overwhelming. Again, as a kid, I just believed this because my parents were adults and smart, right? So that must have been the truth. I tried to reason with myself, but it would never go away. I always felt like they were watching me or targeting me, and if I wasn't looking at them, they would engulf me or something like that. I know, I sound crazy or just very imaginative for a child, but I really felt like I was in danger. Obviously, I didn't have fun when we went here. I hardly slept. I worried I would be taken. I was afraid to go swimming in the nearby stream or river or whatever it was. I would fish with my dad. That way I was near someone, in case I was drawn into the water or something, but I wouldn't ever do anything alone. Then, as I got older, I expected this irrational fear to fade, but it got worse. I started getting physically ill or dizzy while I was up there. I remember one time I helped my dad set up our tents, and then went in and tried to sleep, but I kept feeling like I was being rocked, like what I would imagine it would feel like as an infant. To make it worse, it would fade about an hour after we left, so my parents would think that I was faking it. It pretty much ruined camping for me, because that was typically where we camped, so I would try to suggest another place, or I would end up faking feeling ill for a day or two before, just to try to get out of it. Sometimes it worked, and I would be left at my grandparents' house, but not every time. Thankfully, I got older and was no longer required to go on these miserable attempts of family time. My parents split up, though they were never actually married, and I lived with my mom, but was never required to go over to my dad's. So, if he went camping and I was going to be there, I was typically busy that weekend. Many years later, I'm an adult, living on my own, and I just recently moved back in with my mom. I started getting into a few subreddits about paranormal and unexplained events, and it made me think of this forest. I started talking to people about it, and one of the most common questions I got was if I had gone back as an adult. And of course, at first I thought, well, hell no. But then again, I was trying to be reasonable and tell myself that it had to just be a fear. A lot of people wanted me to return with a camera to see if I could catch anything on film. I didn't have anything going on as I was between jobs, which is why I actually moved back home, so why not go and see if I really was a paranoid kid or if I'm about to go viral? So, I headed out with probably too many safety items, including a radio, my phone, a battery bank, a first aid kit, a pocket knife, and other things that I don't remember, as well as my crappy old GoPro that I got cheap from a yard sale. I strapped it to my head so I could get everything that I was seeing too. The battery was supposed to last about 8 hours, and I wasn't planning on being there for more than an hour, so I figured I would be set. I pulled into the parking lot and texted my mom and a friend to let them know where I was, in case I didn't come home, and I headed in. As I got maybe a foot or two in, the sinking feeling immediately hit me. It felt like you just ran into something that you didn't like for the first time in years, and you knew that it wasn't going to end well. I took a deep breath and I continued in. I checked my phone and noticed that it was around noon at the time. Then, the feeling started to get worse. The air seemed thick and heavy, but it didn't feel like it was humid, beside the fact that the humidity had been low that day. Then, that feeling of being watched came back. I looked all around, and I saw no one or nothing that could possibly have been watching me. I even called out if someone was nearby, and there was no answer. In fact, it was dead silent. There wasn't even a crunching of leaves or sticks on the ground, that slight swaying of trees, or even the sounds of squirrels. Stupidly, I continued in, though, to find the area we always camped at. I remembered and studied the path to make sure that I knew how to get out, in case anything happened to me or my parents, but when I got there, the only trace left was the rocky area leading down to the water where we used to fish. It seemed like there were even new trees that were growing where we would set up our tents. As I started explaining this to the camera, I started getting disoriented, and I mentioned this. That's when the overwhelming sense of dread came. I still heard nothing. I saw nothing other than the trees, but it seemed to fall even more silent. I couldn't even hear the water rushing nearby. I didn't want to pass out in here, never knowing what could happen to me, so I started making my way out. As I started walking back, I looked at my phone and noticed that it was about 12:40. Knowing that it took me about 30 minutes to walk back as I looked around, I expected to be back out at 1:30 at the latest. Knowing that I was walking faster, I kind of expected to be out sooner. However, as I started walking back, I again started to feel like something was watching or following me. Then the feeling grew even worse, and I finally broke into a sprint to get out of there. After what felt like forever, I made it back to the entrance, ran past the older couple that was taking pictures, and I hopped into my car, locking the door. As I sat there, trying to compose myself, I noticed that the sky was a pink and orange color and that the sun was setting. I thought this wasn't possible since it would have only have been around 2 p.m. when I pulled out my phone and noticed it was nearly 6. I had lost 6 hours. And that's when I noticed I had several missed calls and texts from both my mom and my friend. My friend knew how I felt about these woods, so they tried to make sure that I was all right. I know that I didn't get the best reception there, but I had missed text in between 1 to 6 p.m. since I had been out. I turned on my car, and the clock on it also confirmed that it was around 6. I still have no explanation as to how I lost so much time. To add to my fears of this place, I went home, passed out, and I checked the footage the next day. To my surprise, or rather my confusion, the battery was dead, and there was only about 2 or 3 hours of footage on it. It all started as I remembered it, walking to the camp area, talking to myself. I walked up to the water, and then as I was talking about where we camped, the video seemed to cut in and out, and then it was just horrible static with a bad grainy video of these trees. It was like that for most of the video, until it came back to me talking about leaving and running back. How could there be so much time of just trees, but then cut right back to the video like there was no time missed? It was like this footage was added to it almost. So I have the video showing I was there for 2 to 3 hours, but according to my phone and car, I was in there for nearly 6. I showed my friend, and they thought it was creepy as well, but now, several years later, I honestly can't find where I kept or saved the footage, and that GoPro was stolen, so unfortunately, all I have are these unwanted memories of this place. I still don't know what to make of it, and if anyone has any ideas, I am more than willing to listen. I don't know if there's some kind of spirit there, or if it truly is those trees, but I think I got lucky on that last visit, and therefore, no matter what, I will never be going back. A little bit of background about myself. I've worked my entire adult life in the Pacific Northwest woods. Over 15 years in total, with about 7 years of that being for the Park Service at Olympic National Park. Many, many experiences over the years could warrant the title of creepy. This one in particular has always stuck with me. While working for the Park Service, one of my jobs was that of a restoration carpenter. We would travel to old backcountry historical cabins, emergency shelters, homesteads, and chalets tasked with repairing and restoring them to their original historic accurate states. This was a wonderful and demanding job. I'd spend 8 days at a time living off the beaten path, usually deep in the backcountry. Sometimes we'd be flown in supplies, sometimes we'd use llamas or mules to pack our gear, all the while sleeping in thinly walled single tents, cooking over a fire or whisper light stove, using the same tools and techniques the original homesteaders had at their disposal in the late 1800s to construct and survive this unforgiving environment. One late fall, I was assigned to work near Lake Ozette at an old homestead off the trail, near the constructed boardwalk. For those unfamiliar with the area, Lake Ozette is 8 miles long and 3 miles wide. It sits as the largest unaltered natural lake in Washington. Lake Ozette has a large and rich history of Native American culture. The Macaw Tribal Center in Nia Bay houses discoveries found in the area dating back 2,000 years, along with a local village that was well preserved over 300 years ago by a mudslide that left most of the artifacts intact. The Ozette Loop Trail, which the homestead was directly adjacent to, is approximately 9.4 miles through and through. The man-made boardwalk takes you under giant cedar groves, meanders through huge patches of chest-high salal, before delivering you to Alstrom's Prairie, about 2.5 miles from the trailhead. Alstrom's Prairie, a giant soggy meadow, was once farmed by 2 Swedish immigrants. They constructed a small cabin and some outbuildings on the 150-acre bog. With cattle, sheep, vegetable gardens, and the help of a little Swedish ingenuity, they managed to etch out lives for themselves here over 50 years ago. Over time, the forest, as it always does, decided to take back what was once its own. The now decades-long abandoned farm was hardly recognizable. Our job was to beat back the encroaching forest put new windows in the main cabin, pipe in a new stove, apply some fresh paint, and fix up portions of the semi-dilapidated barn. The ultimate goal being to allow guided tours to take place sometime in the future. For about 3 weeks, we stayed at the OZ bunkhouse while working at Alstrom's. This was good duty for us. We weren't sleeping under the rain, our beds were warm, our hike was short and the terrain not difficult. We even had TV. The bunkhouse was located near the highway and ranger station. We would hike the 5-mile loop every day, bringing with us boards, tools, paint, and everything else that we needed on our backs. These were full 10-plus hour days. Usually started our morning hike around 0700 and beginning our evening return hike back to the bunkhouses around 1700. At one point during the fall, there were 4 of us working this project, but at the time of this event, there were only 2 of us remaining. Most of the hard work had already been finished. We needed to hike a few last boards into the prairie to complete a portion of the woodshed before we could call the job done. I volunteered to be the pack mule for the day, my only job being to carry as many boards as I could muster in each trip to the prairie before returning to the ranger station for the next load. It was late in the season for hikers at this point. The weather had turned and we'd be lucky to see 2 to 3 people a day doing the loop. After around my 4th or 5th trip, I was pretty wiped. It was getting late in the evening now, around 1600, and my coworkers had called it a day. I thought I could get one more trip in before it got too dark, my rationale being the more trips I did today, the less I would have to do tomorrow. We passed on the trail, I told him my intentions, and continued on. I delivered the last of the boards for the day, took a look around the prairie as the sun started to tuck behind the trees, and started my hour hike back to the ranger station. The lighting on the boardwalk was quite low at this point. The cedars were blocking most of the ambient light left by the setting sun, and making visibility quite diminished. I'm not a nervous hiker, and I fail to spook easily. Having solo hiked for weeks on end in the backcountry, I've been stalked by cougars, confronted by Kodiak bears in Alaska. I even ran into a few demented hillbillies over the years. As I left the prairie that evening, the hair on my neck stood on end. Goosebumps erupted from my forearms. An uneasy feeling swept over me. Suddenly, I wanted to walk faster, jog, and then sprint. I didn't. Instead, I convinced myself I'd been reading too many fantasy novels before bedtime. I walked another 5 minutes or so before I started to hear something faint. Something that sounded like music. Impossible, I told myself. I'm the only one out here and still at least 2 miles from civilization. That civilization in reality being likely the only other soul out there, my coworker. Sure enough, however, I heard music. More specifically, a piano. It started out so faint, I had to stop and actually try to hear it. The steps on the wooden boardwalk being too loud. Every time I paused to hear it, it became unmistakable and it got louder. I stood there, sun now fully hidden behind the horizon, in total silence other than this piano. I became aware that there were no longer the sounds of life. No birds, no insects, no wind, no rustling of leaves or underbrush. Absolutely nothing other than this piano sound. As if everything was being weighted down by a fog of emptiness of some sorts. I've encountered this dead time before in the woods. Certain places have it. But this was different, somehow. Unique to this place. Unique to this moment in time. I tried to focus on the keys, but I couldn't recognize the composition. Unsurprising, as I mostly listened to Metallica and Korn at the time. It was playing with a purpose. It was controlled, in tune, thoughtful. It was a song, and somehow I felt that it was meant just for me in this moment. I started walking again. Almost on cue, the music once again got louder. As my pace increased, so did the tempo of the keys, but still in tune, never faltering. It reached a climax, the perfect combination of my haste, my dread, my heartbeat, and the tempo of this music. Then, as quickly as it came, the piano just stopped, whooshed away in the fraction of a moment. It didn't trail off, it didn't fade into extinction, it was just gone. Suddenly, everything that was absent was swept away as if by a gust of wind. The stillness was gone, the gloom, the stagnation, and weight of everything was lifted. My next step on the board was once again in reality. The evening was just as absent of light as before, but it felt like life, somehow, was once again injected back into the forest. The woods seemed normal again. I didn't hear that piano again that night, nor since. I told my coworker every detail when I reached the bunkhouse, and he showed no sign of disbelief. We didn't talk about it again until years later, when something similar happened to another Park Service employee. When I told my grandfather about what had happened, as he was a retired Park Service ranger who had worked nearby at Mora, the next station over, without the least bit of hesitation he asked, "Did you hear the bagpipes along with it? Or was it just the piano this time?" It seems as if I've learned and experienced since then that there's a lot more to that place. A lot more to the Olympics in general than anyone really knows or is willing to admit. A few years ago, I went camping for the first time in my life. I was about 11 or 12 when we headed out to the forest nearby our house. We were in Poland for the holidays, as every year, and right next to our house was a huge forest. So, one day, we decided to take out my mom's old tent that she still had from the 90s and just stay for the night or two in between some wildlife. Good thing, the place we chose to sleep at was only about 20, maybe 30 minutes away from the house. Bad thing, there are a lot, and I mean a lot, of wolves, foxes, and boars out in that forest. And honestly, I kind of regretted going there in the first place. We set everything up at around 6 p.m., and my sister and I set up the campfire. My dad chopped down a smaller tree earlier with his oak axe, and that's important for a later part of the story, and by now it had dried out enough to catch fire. We sat around it for quite some time, probably around 4 hours, until it was dark, so we decided to just head to sleep then. My two sisters and I on one end of the tent, and my parents on the other. It was probably just the fear of getting eaten alive by some wolves, or maybe homesickness, but I couldn't sleep at all. I heard my dad tell my mom he was going to go out into the forest to get some wood for the morning, while it was still fairly dry, or it would have all soaked up the dew by then. The thought of not having my dad around made it even worse for me to close my eyes for a second. I'm not too good at telling what time it is by just staring at the sky, or trying to figure out how long it's been, so I'll just say it was around 12 or 1 in the morning. I was actually falling asleep when I heard some rattling outside the tent. My first thought? Wolf. I was terrified, and so I just popped out my head through the little curtain that separated the two halves of the tent, basically a thin piece of fabric just hanging on some threads, to see if my dad was back. He was still gone, and it had been about an hour since he went. I laid back down and just tried to fall asleep, but when I turned myself on my side and saw this faint human shadow outside of the tent, I froze and let out a tiny squeak. The person seemed to be holding some sort of axe, shovel thing in hand, and so I thought it might have just been my dad coming back. The shadow walked toward the entrance of the tent and just stood there at the zipped up door for maybe 30 seconds. I began to wonder why he wasn't just coming inside. The person finally ran off into the forest, but they dropped the axe. You could hear the footsteps fade in the distance, and a thump just happened along the way. Maybe a minute or so later, I hear my dad walking back from the opposite side of the forest and enter the tent all tired, and just fell asleep. It seemed kind of sketchy and fishy and scary to me, but it was so late that I couldn't even think anymore, and I somehow fell asleep. The next morning, I woke up after my dad dropped his phone on his face, letting out an ouch. I peeped through the curtain at him, and he just smiled back while rubbing his nose. I needed some fresh air, because I was feeling a bit sick. Maybe from the nerves in the morning or homesickness, but I really couldn't tell. Both of us got out of the tent and walked around for a while. We circled around the campsite for around 10 minutes until we came back to our tent. That's when I noticed something that ran the chills down my back. A few meters from the tent, in the corner of my eye, I managed to catch a glimpse of something red. It took me a hot second to realize that I actually saw something. And when I turned my head to see what it was a red and black rubber axe. It was not there before. I knew it wasn't my dad's, because his was by the pile of wood that he collected at night. From my dad's reaction, I probably turned pale because he started to freak out a little, like I was about to pass out or something. He turned his gaze to where I was looking, and we both just stared for a few seconds before he called out for the rest of the family to wake up and get moving. We were all packed up within an hour, and we rushed back home. I later told my dad what I saw that night, and he wouldn't believe me at first. I carried on with the story until he finally realized that I was telling the truth. To this day, I still have no clue who the hell that was, but I'm just happy he didn't investigate our tent any further, or any other animal in that forest. So, to the Axeman who was outside my tent in the middle of the night, let's not meet. I've been debating on posting this. Not because I've been scared, but simply because this is my first post since joining Reddit. I'll start off by explaining the area so you can get a good picture of where this occurred. We live in a small neighborhood. All of the surrounding streets dead end into a half-circle park. Behind the park, there are some woods and a railroad track. When we were younger, we all played in the front part of the woods. We never ventured too far back. This was our play area for years. We never had an issue or scare. This area was a pretty and well-lit wooded area. Anyhow, one day, my brother Jimmy, my best friend Sarah, and my brother's best friend Ian were all building a dam in the middle of a small creek that ran through the park in the woods. The boys decided that they were going to head back to Ian's house for some snacks. Sarah and I said we would stay and finish our camp area. As we're moving rocks around, I get a very odd feeling come over me. A strange feeling that we're being watched. I immediately think it's the boys trying to scare us and just continue with what we're doing. Sarah and I load up some big rocks and head back to the creek and put them down at the dam. I get that feeling again, and as I stand up, I see something straight in front of me about 30 feet away. I can't clearly make out what it is yet because it's behind a bush, but I do see that it has a pattern of red and blue. I know that's nothing the boys had on, so at this point, I'm just trying to focus and figure out what it is. As I'm scanning up the bush, I start to realize it's a clown. I kid you not, my heart started pounding immediately. The clown and my eyes lock. He's wearing a blue and red hat with a reverse pattern red and blue jumpsuit. I grab Sarah's shirt and immediately pull her upright, and she notices the man right away. He's smiling with a full face of makeup, and he has a huge knife. We both say nothing and start running as fast as our legs can take us. He begins to follow. We can hear twigs snapping and ground crunching, but we're booking it. We run through the front of the woods through the side of the park and up her dead-end street. Ian and Jimmy are 2 houses up from the end and see us running and are screaming, "What is going on?" While running past, we scream, "There's a clown," and they start laughing. We're still running, screaming for our lives, and finally make it to the middle of the street where Sarah's dad, Danny, is now running out the front door because he hears us screaming. We meet Danny right at the beginning of the neighbor's house, and we're trying to explain what we saw, and he says, "Girls, stop it now. This is ridiculous. What are you even talking about?" We try to catch our breath. By this time, Jimmy and Ian have caught up to us. We're crying and pointing and telling Danny again that we saw a clown with a knife. Jimmy and Ian are laughing, and Danny is asking if they played a prank on us. About this time, an old yellow Pinto-type car comes up from the dead end at the park and pulls right up next to the sidewalk of the yard we are in. Sure enough, plain as day, it is the freaking clown. No hat this time, but knife in hand, and he's telling us to come here. Danny starts shoving us all towards the house, and he himself is scared and running now. The car drives off down the street. We get inside, and Danny calls the police. We had to give statements, and the police patrolled the neighborhood and the park for a few weeks. We were never allowed to go in the park again, and a few months after that, the city started to clear out the woods. They cut down many of the trees and made a walking area that you could see through all the way to the train tracks. My friend and I used to talk about this many times up until her death. No one would believe us had they not seen it as well. It was just so scary. I think they only got to see him because whoever it was had to go down the dead-end street to leave the neighborhood. Either way, this man was not afraid of us, nor the small group of people that had gathered from our screaming. He very bravely stopped right in front of us as her father tried to comfort us and calm us down, all while flashing his knife. We are lucky to be alive, I feel. Had it just been one of us left in the woods, which sometimes occurred, I don't think there would have been a group of 4 of us any longer. Sarah's dad actually stopped drinking that day, and we all now have a fear of clowns. So this was today's collection of Deep Woods stories, or stories in the woods, however you want to look at that. Stories based around wooded areas. Now, where I used to live as a kid was right down the street from a very large wooded area. It was suburban, but it was suburban with a touch of rural, I guess. There was a lot of trees in the area. We didn't live in a small town, but like it was a subdivision neighborhood of the Kansas City, Kansas area. A small district, I guess, is what it would be. And there was a wooded area down the way, and those woods, they were always kind of creepy. There were a bunch of, dumb kid rumors that went around because there were a lot of kids in the area. Whenever we lived there, high school age, telling younger kids, like, oh, there was werewolves, there's wolves, blah, blah, blah. But something about them, it was always just kind of sketchy. Like, I never, ever wanted to go in there as a kid. And I don't know why. I would think as a kid I'd want to explore things, because that's kind of the kid I was. But, I mean, I was kind of shy, quiet, and reserved, but I still had that air of curiosity that a child has. I never, ever wanted to go in those woods, ever. So, I don't know. Kind of creepy. Don't know what to think about them. Anyways, hopefully you all enjoyed this collection of stories. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button. That really does help a lot. Pushes the video harder into the algorithm, and interactions are kind of down right now, so if you could do that, that would mean a lot to me. You could also please comment, letting me know your thoughts on these stories, if you've ever had an experience in the woods, or if you have a suggestion on what I should cover in another story video collection thingy. Leave that down there as well. I am collecting suggestions from comments. Some other people have commented other things. I have those on a list, and I am looking into them. It may be a couple months, so March to April before I get to them, because I'm very meticulous about my scheduling. I have next month's videos already planned out for what I want, so March at the earliest, April probably at the latest. Definitely collecting them, definitely paying attention, so please, please, please do leave your ideas. I promise you I'm reading them. And I will comment as well. I will respond to your comments to let you know I'm reading them as well. Anyways, long outro. All that said, friends, if you enjoyed the video, again, thank you. Thumbs up, subscribe, leave a comment, and look forward to the next one. It's coming soon. Probably Monday. Probably Glitch in the Matrix, because that's what I do. Anyways, friends, I love you all. I hope you have a fantastic weekend, and I hope you're doing well. And of course, until next time, sleep well.